Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here again. I'm back in Denmark, and also a pleasure to speak at this conference. There isn't a lot of time, so I would like to kick off if I can find my PowerPoint that I will use to keep myself on track. There it is. That's the button I was looking for. Okay. I have 25 minutes in which I want to share some reflections on this question of professional judgment and its role in education. I'm particularly looking at the future of professional judgment, and I hope that it will become clear in my talk what I mean by that and what is happening. In the subtitle, there are three words: evidence, competence, and wisdom, that in a sense hover around this whole discussion of teachers and their judgment. There is a chapter I wrote on this in the book that's going to be presented at the end of today. So if you're really interested in the detail, I would say have a look at that chapter as well. I'll give a sort of a broader account of some of the issues that I think may be relevant for this discussion about professional judgment. And I do this from my own background. I am originally from the Netherlands, but have been working in the UK for the last 20 years, currently at Brunel University in London. But I also work at the University of Humanistic Studies in the Netherlands and have an affiliation with a teacher education college in Norway. So that informs my view on what's happening in the world. And I've the privilege to be a member of the Education Council of the Netherlands, which is a group of people that gives advice to the Dutch government and parliament and ministry on educational matters. And many of these discussions about professional judgment also play a role there, so I will also refer to some of the work we do there. My reading of Danish is pretty good, but when people start to speak it, I'm completely lost. But one word I picked up was the name of Cristiano Ronaldo, the footballer. And if I had more time, I would have actually shown you a video clip of Ronaldo in order to make something clear about judgment. And particularly the point I want to make is Ronaldo is a machine where judgment actually plays no role. He can perform what he does anywhere, and there's a very funny video clip where it's shown that he can even pitch a ball into the goal in the complete dark. So he doesn't need to adjust to the situation. You just give him a bit and he goes. But that's not what teaching is about, I think. I have no idea what you said about it, so I may get into trouble already. So I have a lot of text, but if you really want to get a sense of what I think that we shouldn't forget when we talk about professional judgment, I want to show you a picture that hangs in the portrait gallery in Scotland. And it's a picture of three oncologists, three medical doctors in the academic hospital in Edinburgh. And this museum is full of sort of official pictures of people, and you usually see their head and some important background. But this picture shows something very different about medical practice. It's a very big picture. It's almost about the size you see here. And the first time I saw it, I was just stunned and shocked about what I was seeing there. And these are three real-life oncologists, and the picture is based on conversations the painter had with them about what is this work, what is the medical profession, what does it mean to be there. And what these doctors described was that they say, well, of course we have a lot of knowledge and a lot of research and a lot of expertise, but each time we meet a patient with cancer, it feels like we go really into the dark to meet something that we do not really know what we are meeting. And for me, this shows what really the core of judgment is, why we need it, because we encounter situations where we do not exactly know what we will meet. And this picture, I think, points that in a really impressive way. So you may forget everything I'm going to say in my talk, but I hope this picture stays with you. And then there is a second chilling picture I want to show you. And that is this one. It's about pigs and pig farming. And it comes out of something that happened in Scotland a couple of weeks ago in the national weekly newspaper for teachers, the Times Education Supplement, where a number of people were interviewed, including myself, about particular attempts that are going on in England and Scotland to provide a research base for teaching. And it has a lot to do with questions around evidence, and I hope Tone will also say important things about this complex notion of evidence. What has been happening in England is a lot of research that tries to find out if teachers do A, what will follow. And out of that, there is now a website called the Teaching and Learning Toolkit that tries to say, this is the research that exists about that, this is how sure we are about it, and these are the costs. And Scotland is now also rolling this out. And the journalist asked me, do you think that this is sort of good knowledge and proper science? And I said, well, we can have long conversations about that. But my main concern is actually that this way of generating research about teaching is doing something else. It is, in presenting a particular kind of knowledge, also promoting a particular kind of understanding of what education is, how it works, and what it is for. And I said, and I shouldn't have done this because this is what journalists are always after, I said it looks like it's turning education into the logic of pig farming, and that's where I am concerned. And of course, then the journalist thought, oh, brilliant, we have a picture, and that is what ended up in the newspaper. But the question for me there is not just a question about what kind of research do we need, but also in research that's being generated, what is that actually communicating about what education is? So there is an optimistic reading that says it's wonderful that we get all this kind of knowledge, it's helpful information for teachers to make better judgments. It may also be a helpful device for policymakers to say, should we put our money there or there? But the more worrying reading is to say, what is also going on, you could say, is maybe a redefinition of education and the work of the teacher. And if we talk about professional judgment in education, it also has a lot to do with the work and the position and the space for teachers. And one thing I see happening, and I formulate it here very quickly, is a tendency, because of not bad intentions. I mean, I've never met anyone in education who said, my intention is to make education worse. So everyone wants to make education better, but that's where the problem starts, because what is better, and people have very different ideas about that. And some people have a lot of energy, and other people have a lot of money, and that creates, I think, complex problems that we need to be mindful of. That's one of the points I want to make. But what I see happening in many places, you can say, is a shift from a broad understanding of education as having to do with human beings and their existence in a meaningful way in democratic societies, towards a much more narrow view of what education is about. And then I hear phrases like, it's all about the effective production of learning outcomes. And now these are two extremes, but I am worried about this change that's happening. And some people say that is what should be happening, other people just observe that that is suddenly happening, and I think we need to be very careful of what is happening there. So, from the Danish I know, the questions that frame today's discussion are really good questions about teaching teachers in education. What is professional judgment? What is educational judgment? How does that actually work? And what kind of research can help in the task of judging? But what we should be mindful of is that these are not sort of innocent, nice intellectual questions. They take place in particular environments and in particular political dynamics. And whereas maybe 50 years ago, education was a fairly sort of quiet part of society, nowadays education is at the forefront of a lot of what's happening in politics and politicians. You could even say that education suffers from bigger dynamics, so politicians know that it's almost impossible to steer the economy. They also know that they shouldn't say a lot about healthcare because that is far too complicated. So if politicians really want to make a difference, then sort of education is the only area left. So we suffer from that as well. So what are these political dimensions of what's going on in this discussion about teaching, teachers, research, and judgment? It partly has to do with political questions around education. The question what actually counts as education, what do we think that good education is, but also questions about what counts in education. What do we say that should be happening there? And I'll come back to that because with the Education Council in the Netherlands, we are doing particular work there. But it also has a lot to do with teaching and teachers. The question, what actually counts as teaching? Have we created education systems in which teachers are still allowed to think, to judge, and to act? Because it's one thing to talk about judgment in teaching, but it's still another to ask, is there a place in schools for teachers to make judgments and act on those judgments? So what is the space and scope for professional judgment, which in work I've done with colleagues, we don't refer to as the question of teacher autonomy, because before you know it, you bring it back sort of to individuals who say, I want to be autonomous and I don't want to be in conversation with the wider world. We call it the question of teacher agency, the possibility for teachers to be active agents in their practice, individually and collectively. And then there is also the politics of research. So again, I picked up from the program that what we need is good and useful research. And of course, no one is against good and useful research, but the big question is, what counts as good research and what counts as useful research? And that again brings in much bigger questions about what is actually the knowledge that is around in this complex field of education, and who has the right to claim knowledge? Can teachers claim knowledge about their profession, or should evidence replace that knowledge? These are bigger questions. So I'm talking about, you can say, the bigger context of this discussion about professional judgment in education. And I see some developments that I am concerned about, and I want to name those developments and then focus in a bit on this question. So what then is educational judgment? So where did many of these developments about we need better research or we need to open up the classroom, where did they start? They started with something that remains absolutely central and which we can call the social judgment justice argument, that every child and young person, irrespective of where they are or where they are from, should have access to good education. I can't think of anyone who would be against it, although I know that there are people who are against it and say, well, education is only for the elites, and some people don't need education, they just need to work. But I think in civilized societies, we should believe that everyone has the right to receive good education. So there is nothing wrong with the intention. But what I'm now going to do is, I think in about 7 lines, I'll trace a history of about 20 years of what has happened with that intention and where some things have shifted. In English they call that the slippery slope. So you start somewhere, that's fantastic, and at some point you end up somewhere where you think, well, how did we end up there? So you start with this question, how can we make sure that education is everywhere of the same quality? That's a good question. Then the question comes up, but how can we make the quality of education visible? And again, you can say, question of judgment, a good question. Then something happens, because some people begin to say, well, if we really want to pin down quality, we need to start to measure it. And then another little shift happened where people say, well, where do we measure it? Not sort of in what we give to students or the processes that happen, but actually we should be looking at what comes out of education. So suddenly people are talking about educational outcomes and the measurement of that. Then it raises the question, what kind of outcomes should be measured? Again, a good question. But before you know it, something else happens, and people say, well, what kind of outcomes can actually be measured? Because there are soft and vague outcomes that are very difficult to measure, but there's also stuff that can be measured very easily. And then, sort of, in all these steps, we end up somewhere, what I think is a predicament of a lot of measurement currently in education. Is that measurement still trying to make visible what we think is important about education? Or have we ended up in a situation where people begin to value what is being measured? Where they say, if we want to know what the quality of education is, just take the PISA statistics, forgetting that PISA takes a very narrow, particular slice from the whole complexity of education. And in the background, all kind of other discussions happen there as well. For example, this constant reference to the basics. We have to make sure that the basics are in order. And when I look at what people refer to as the basics, you often find sort of language and mathematics and science. And then I keep thinking, but what would happen if in a country all the inhabitants are brilliant in language and mathematics and science, but they have forgotten any sense of what it means to live together peacefully or democratically? I think then we have not really taken care of the basics that should matter as well. So I think the result of all these little steps, when they add up, we end up in a problematic space. And that's partly the space in which we are now, you can say, back together to talk about teachers, their professional judgment, and good education. It's good to be back and talk about that. But we've ended up with quite a narrow definition of what counts in education. We have ended up with not so much talking about the provision and the processes, but sometimes I would say an obsession just with outcomes. With that has come a way of thinking about education in terms of an input-output view of education. I'll come back to that. And also something has happened with the teacher. There are quite a lot of people who now say research has shown that the teacher is the most important factor in education. Or you can even, if you are a bit more precise, they call it the most important in-school factor in education. And what I find problematic there, and I think it's an insult to teachers, is to refer to the teacher as a factor. Because then we no longer have thinking and judging professionals there, but the teacher has become a variable in thinking about. We put something in and then something comes out. So for me, this also has a lot to say about the position of the teacher as a professional who thinks, judges, and acts. I'm looking at the clock, but there is a story circulating that a professor of school effectiveness said the main blockage to making education really effective lies in the fact that teachers think. And if we can stop them from thinking, then we can make schools effective. And I always say this is technically right, because a thinking teacher is an unpredictable element, but it's morally wrong. And that's part of the tension where we are. So then you end up with education getting into a very different logic. You put something in, and then you measure whether the pigs grow. And that's a very one-dimensional and too simplistic question of education. So I would say this is not where we should want to be. And that's why the ongoing conversation about where do we want to be and what's the position of the teacher in that is really important. But it is where we find ourselves. So a big question is, how can we reclaim a meaningful understanding of education and a space for teachers to play the role they should be playing there? Now, what also hasn't helped in this discussion, and this is part of my own work, is language. One thing I've tried to highlight is that the language in education over the past, again, 10 to 20 years has shifted from a language of education where we talk about pupils or students, about teaching, about schools, about adult education, very much to a language of learning, learners, learning environments, facilitating learning, lifelong learning. And I think that there is a problem, and this is a crude way of putting it. And I also have a quote here to say how easy this language of learning is. I would say the point of education is not that children or young people learn. And there is something on its way, but it's important to pause here, because when you look around and see how people speak about education, it's very easy to stop here and say, yeah, of course the point of education is that they learn. And I want to make the point that that's not precise enough. I would say in education, when we bring sort of resources and people together and give time and attention, there is a far more particular task, namely that children and young people learn something, that they learn it for a reason, and that they learn it from someone. So for me, education always raises these questions of content, purpose, and relationships. And I find it remarkable that this language of learning sort of, yeah, quite often it makes it much more difficult to keep those questions into view. There are other things about learning. You can say, well, children should learn in school, but that doesn't say a lot, because children learn very strange things in school. For example, that they are not good at something, that they're worthless, that they are not clever enough. And that's not what we want children to learn. And we shouldn't forget, but that's a whole different discussion, it's always human beings who learn with complex subjective lives. So it's not brains that learn or systems. So content, purpose, and relationships, that's what we need to talk about when we talk about education. And then there is something special about this job of education. When we look at the question of purpose, and I think this makes our field and our profession unique, namely that in education we do not have to take care for only one purpose, but we actually have to be concerned about three purposes or domains of purpose. I do it very quickly, but in my own work I make a distinction between qualification. Part of our job is knowledge, skills, dispositions. But we do something else as well. We also provide orientation. We present the world to our students and try to help them to find a place there. That's the work of socialization. And education always also does something with the person. And what we hope is that the students in our classroom don't become sort of obedient robots. We want them to be people who can think for themselves, who can also feel for themselves and want to take responsibility for being in the world. So education is actually a three-dimensional business. and therefore we need three-dimensional professionals and three-dimensional research. That's my main message. This is a very simple picture to say there are three domains we need to take care of, and that's far more difficult than the work of medical doctors. They only have one domain called health, the promotion of health. Of course, complicated discussions about what health is, but at least they go in one direction. We always have to take care of these three directions. And you can see with this simple picture that if you begin to say, well, actually only one of these domains is really important, and there is a lot of pressure to say, actually it's only the knowledge and the skills, it means that we're not paying enough attention to what is happening in these other domains. And you can see education systems that push tremendously just on the knowledge and the learning outcomes there. They create quite a lot of social, psychological, existential problems in young people. So good education is in balance and requires this three-dimensional thinking. That's the particular difficulty of our work. Thinking about the work of the teacher three-dimensionally sort of begins to show what professional judgment needs to do there. And when again I was looking for pictures, I was thinking, well, maybe the work of the teacher is like simultaneous chess. That's part of what we do. We play a different chess game with all of our students. But actually, if we think of that three-dimensionally, we are doing something else. We are playing three-dimensional chess with all our students. And this is an interesting game of three complete chess games, but they hang on top of each other. And what is brilliant about this picture is that when we make a move in one of the games, it not only influences what we're doing there, but it has an impact on these other two domains as well. And that's the particular difficulty in education. When we make a move, say, to produce cognitive learning outcomes, it also does something with how we orient our students in the world, and it also does something with their soul. Does three-dimensional chess exist? It exists in Star Trek, so maybe that. But I find this a helpful picture to say, so this is the particular work of educators. I'm nearly there. And when you begin to look at the work of the teacher in that way, then we can become much more precise about what kind of judgments are actually constantly being asked for teachers. One is, of course, what do we actually want our students to achieve in each of those domains? Not just the knowledge and skills, but also the orientation and their personhood, their way of existing in the world. Then there is the question, how do we get there? And a lot of people say that's only a question of effectiveness, and I think that's wrong, because the ways in which we organize education also have an educative message. So we can never just say, let's be effective. We always also have to say, is the way in which we do that, is that sending out the right messages. If we want to drive for test scores, we should just pay our students as much money as they need. But as soon as you say that, you see that that may be effective, but that's not how we want to drive education. And then, of course, these three domains are always in tension. So a big question is, how do we keep them in balance, and how do we deal with trade-offs? Again, we can make education work in one of these domains, but it comes at a price for what's possible in the other domains. So there is a lot of balancing going on, and exactly for these questions, I would say, we need judgment. Evidence only gives us something partially. To bring that back into the complexities of the whole of education, we need wise, situated judgment. So that's my answer to the first question. And there's a lot to say. All these judgments are always pragmatic. They always go back to the question, what do we want to achieve? So there are all these messages circulating in education, like everything should be flexible, everything should focus on the student, everything should be visible and transparent. And my response to that is always, it depends on what we want to achieve. Looking at the time. So if this is what educational judgment is, then we come back to the bigger questions. How can we reclaim a space for that? What does that require politically? What does it require from research? The political work is partly about keeping in conversation about the breadth of education and pushing back against the tendency to come up with narrow definitions. That's the work we've been doing in the Netherlands, where the first chamber of the parliament asked us to say, can you say a bit more about how we should be defining education, because all this focus on measurement is just narrowing down what's happening. So the main message we gave is to say education has to take care of these three domains. And that raises all kinds of questions, for example, about if you put school inspectors into schools, what should they be looking at? So the school inspection in the Netherlands is changing, and we had a meeting with members of parliament last Tuesday where they said, well, maybe we also need to start changing our education laws because the current laws are also not happening there. The same with the space for teachers, because that space is also very much defined politically. And again, we are in conversation on request of the second chamber of the parliament to say, how can we open that space? How can we create more space for teachers? So that's important political work, and we all need to do that. And then there are messages for research, but I hope that the further discussion about evidence also will come back to it. Teaching is always about possibilities, but never about certainty. So if there is research that says we can give you certainty, it's a misunderstanding of the complex reality of teaching. So there are questions about what kind of knowledge we need. The question of what works is a very seductive question, but it's the wrong question, because the question of working always has to be connected to what works for what. And if we agree that education has three domains to take care of, then we can never give one-dimensional answers. That's the problem with Hattie's book, and also how Hattie is hovering around the world. And of course, we can make everything work in education, but it always comes at a price. And the real question is, what is the price we should be willing to pay for that? So we also need three-dimensional research. And all of that comes back to the importance, I think, of understanding what teaching is, that it's not an intervention upon objects so that we get measurable outcomes. That's not even how good pig farming should be working, by the way. Education, at the end of the day, is an interaction between subjects, between human beings, aimed at enhancing possibilities for living together well. And living together well has to do with democracy, with peace, and with sustainability. So that, for me, is the bigger context when we talk about educational judgment. Thank you, and sorry for being a bit over time.